All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I know it's never easy to step away from a busy day, so I really appreciate you taking the time to tune in. My name's Erin Bionda, and I'm the marketing coordinator here at BlueCat, and I'm joined today by cybersecurity expert Richard Clarke and BlueCat CEO Michael Harris. Michael's going to talk to us all about the CEO's perspective on security and the role of the CISO. And then we're going to pass it over to Richard, who's going to talk to us about why this role needs to expand in this era where cyber breaches are inevitable. We will have some time for Q&A, and then the last item on our agenda today is the Backstage Pass. So if you want to learn how BlueCat helps cyber teams identify malware, stop lateral movement, and protect assets from insider threats, you'll definitely want to stick around for Scott Penny, BlueCat's Director of Cybersecurity Solutions, when he's going to give us a brief overview of our BlueCat DNS Edge product. If you do have any questions during either presentation, just use the question bar in the right panel of your screen, and we'll get the questions during our Q&A session at the end. And I will be sharing out a recorded version of the session over email to you all afterwards. I see quite a few people now have just joined us, so welcome to all those who are just signed in. We're ready to get going here, so I'm going to pass it over to Michael now to introduce himself and our speaker, Richard. Michael?
Great, thanks, Erin. Hello, and thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm here in BlueCat's Central European headquarters. My name is Michael Harris. I'm the Chairman and CEO of BlueCat. Before getting started, please allow me to introduce Richard Clarke, who's a recognized cybersecurity expert and recently joined BlueCat's Board of Directors. Richard is the CEO of Good Harbor, which provides cyber risk management services to its customers. He's an author of 8 books, I think at least 2 of which are bestsellers, and a former advisor to 3 presidents. He served in the White House, the Pentagon, the intelligence community, and the State Department in various roles, including special advisor on cybersecurity, where he developed the country's national strategy to defend cyberspace, and served on the President's Review Group on Intelligence and Technology. A very impressive resume, obviously. He's going to share his thoughts on the importance of the role of a security executive and how, with expanded jurisdiction, they can help break the cycle of blame and breach and blame. But before I pass it over to Richard, I'd like to give you some of my thoughts. So BlueCat is a network security company with its roots in DNS. As such, I talk to a great deal of security professionals, and what I'm hearing is that we're now in a world of inevitable and constant breaches. And there are many factors impacting security and compliance teams. IT infrastructure is becoming increasingly more complex. The pace at which businesses operate is accelerating, and cyber threats are increasing at a significant rate. What our customers are telling us is that today's discussion is not only about technology, rather it's a conversation about breaking the cycle of breach and blame. The way we have traditionally approached security just isn't enough anymore. Security executives are being asked to protect the very backbone of their operations. However, are they armed with enough resources and power to get the job done effectively and to fully protect their organizations? If not, the damage could be significant. What we must feel when we hear of another spectacular security breach, let alone all the ones that don't make the news, I'm sure you can relate to the ever-mounting pressures facing all of you. From my perspective, each of these breaches had one thing in common. These organizations, to one degree or another, were underprepared, whether it be preventing the breach in the first place, mitigating the damage, or managing the fallout. And with that, we know that the role of the CISO must evolve, and we believe that technical ability, knowledge, and experience alone are not enough. The changing technology landscape that the businesses require in order to compete in today's market demands that the CISO take on a larger and more critical mandate, not only managing the technical aspects of the business, but also handling the business side of cybersecurity. In short, there are 3 key areas that need to be addressed: resources, reporting structure, and the CISO's role itself. Let me delve a little further into each of these 3 areas. In a recent study conducted by Osterman Research, they found that 24% of security professionals felt that one of the largest disagreements they had with C-suite revolved around budgeting and staffing issues. This is a problem that must and can be addressed. Security as a department needs to be given a higher priority when it comes to corporate planning and strategy, and the CISO needs to act as a change agent in his or her organization. Ultimately, it starts with the CISO identifying gaps and building a case when it comes to resources. The CISO needs buy-in for his or her recommendations, but this can be difficult without the right amount of influence. And this, I believe, is one of the most challenging facets of a security professional. And this is where improved reporting structures can help influence change. So please consider this stat. 50% of CISOs who do not report directly into the CEO today expect to do so very soon. This will be a big change from today's environment, with the security executive commonly reporting into IT, legal, or finance, and it will consequently have a significant and positive impact on visibility. Security is no longer just a dialogue between IT professionals within the organization. Security is becoming and must become a board-level consideration, because the question of breaches is when, not if. With so much at stake, CISOs are relying on the executive suite for buy-in and support for security initiatives. And it's vital that the CEO has more visibility into the CISO's world. Stronger communication at the very top is key. Put simply, security breaches directly impact revenue. And when revenue is impacted, enterprise value is impacted. Security must have a seat at the executive table. Security needs to be viewed as a business function, just like operations or finance or other areas that support the business initiative. The last point I want to touch on is that CISO's capabilities needs to change. As the CISO role grows to function at the executive level, new skills and traits are needed. The CISOs need to evolve from an isolated subject matter expert into a strategic decision maker on how technology can improve business. In reference to the stat on the slide, part of the growing challenge in getting the executive teams to understand that cyber risks go beyond compliance and technical problems. The CISO of today's era must be many things: an integrated business thinker, a facilitator of change, a leader in awareness, an evangelist, and an educator. In short, we believe that enterprises must rethink the resources being invested in security, the reporting structure of the security organization, and the role of the CISO itself. Only when this happens will organizations be in a better position to defend itself against and react to breaches. Before I pass the mic over to Richard, I'd like to take a quick poll that I think will magically appear in front of you all, where we're going to be asking you, in your current role, what is your biggest concern? And here it is. How much time do we get for this, Aaron?
Let's just give it 30 more seconds, Michael. We've got 20% have already voted. 25. Give it 20 more seconds. All right, the results are up there, Michael, for you.
I don't think so. They all say 0%.
All right, sorry, it should be showing you the results there. So we've got 21% for A, 18% for B, 22% for C, and 38% for D. So D was definitely our winner there.
Staying ahead of increasingly sophisticated attack methods. Great, thank you. Well, Richard, maybe that's a good place to start.
Yeah, I think so. You know, after all of these big attacks, there is a blame game, and we should just be frank about that. And frequently the blame falls on the CISO. That's unfair, and it's also dysfunctional. So I think we need to talk about the issue of resourcing and the issue of governance structure. And then finally, sort of what the overall role of a CISO is. I work with a lot of CISOs in companies as an advisor. I work with a lot of boards, corporate boards, and a lot of CEOs in the private sector. And what I'm about to say derives from that experience over the last 10 years or so. First, on resourcing. I know every CISO wants more money. And I also know that every CEO and corporate board thinks they're spending too much already on cybersecurity and IT security. The problem is that from the CEO perspective and the board perspective, it seems like a black hole that you could, no matter how much money you give that damn CISO, she'll want more. And I never know when I give them the money. The CEOs tell me, how did that increase my security? What's the relationship? They never quantify this for me. They just ask for new widgets, and it's constantly new widgets. Well, I think the way for a CISO to approach this is to say, what percentage of my IT budget, of the overall enterprise IT budget, is being spent on security? And how does that fit with the norm in the industry? And how does that fit with the norm of companies that are really well secured and have good records? Now, part of this is definitional. What do you consider IT security? Is IAM part of it or not? But putting definitional issues aside, if your company is spending about 3 or 4% of the overall IT budget on security, that's probably not enough. Companies that we see that are successful in either keeping people out or dealing rapidly with them and effectively with them after the breach has been detected, and detecting those breaches early on, are spending 8, 9, 10, some people even 12%. There's also a correlation between when you have been hacked and what you're spending. Companies that have been hacked within the last year and hacked badly end up spending 10 and 12% for 1 year or more to get well. I think what you need to think about is having a technology maturity roadmap that lays out objectives over the course of 2 or 3 years and says, here's where we are now, and here's where I want to get to. And then relates the expenditures to additional capabilities and relates those additional capabilities to what you're preventing. And then, and here's the most critical part, demonstrating what the cost would be if the thing that you're trying to prevent happened. So you can draw a direct relationship between the increased budget you want, the technology you're going to buy, the thing you're going to prevent, and how much that thing would cost the company if it happened, in terms of reputational damage, in terms of customers lost, in terms of regulatory problems, legal problems. There's lots of examples out there of what these costs are. Some people think you can cover that with insurance. You can't. No cyber insurance policy today will cover you for reputational damage or loss of IP. They're just not available.
Right.
And part of this, I think, goes back to when we all started moving everything onto the internet and making everything an IT connected function back in the mid-1990s or so. We saved an enormous amount of money. IT was a way of reducing costs, right? IT was a way of making productivity shoot through the roof. And it did in lots of companies. And if you look at Canada or you look at the US, productivity during the 90s went right up through the roof because people were moving functions into IT supported functions. They're getting rid of lots of staff, lots of buildings that they didn't need, because now that they were IT supported. So we came to think about IT as a cost savings, a huge cost savings. And at the time, in the mid-1990s, we put in a budget for IT security, but it was cheap. because the threats were not sophisticated then. And what did you have to buy in 1997 or 1999? You were buying AV, firewall, IDS, IPS. That's all that existed. In fact, IDS and IPS really didn't come in until 1997 or so. Well, today, the average big enterprise has, on average, 22 different IT security vendors, giving them a whole host of products. Why? Because the threat has evolved and is constantly evolving. And you have to stay one step ahead of the evolving threat. Also because we've introduced all sorts of additional things to target. And by going mobile, by expanding commerce on the web, by going into the cloud, now by going into containers, we're constantly changing the nature of the IT system we're trying to protect at the same time that the threat is getting more sophisticated. So that's a long-winded way of saying when executives got used to what they were going to pay for IT security, they underpriced it. They underpriced it in the late 1990s compared to what it costs now. IT security now costs more because the threat is bigger. And not only is the threat bigger, but the resulting damages to a company can be vastly larger than they could have 10 years ago. And so you have to explain that evolution to a CEO and to a corporate board to say, you can't do the old 3% of the budget anymore and expect not to get hacked, or expect to be able to discover a hack quickly when it occurs. Not at 3%. So
I expect now that you're my board, Dick, I guess I'm going to be getting some more budget for this type of spend.
Well, actually, you're doing pretty well to begin with. So
yeah, thank you. Look, you mentioned that companies are buying all of these products. Are they over buying products and under resourcing those? Do you have a sense that, and do you see products sitting on the shelves or not being implemented effectively because of lack of resourcing?
No, not usually. But there is a problem sometimes with the people, particularly after they've been hacked. Companies throw money at IT, and they don't relate it to the risk profile of that individual company. Every company is different, and some companies need certain kinds of security products and not others. It depends on what you're trying to prevent, and it depends on what you're trying to protect. What are your crown jewels? What is your worst case scenario? You have to know that first. Know what you're trying to prevent. Know what you're trying to protect, and realize you can't protect it all. Realize you're no longer in the situation where you're going to keep the guys out of your network. Now what you're trying to do is know when they get into your network, know quickly, and be able to contain the damage when they break in. And that means encryption, perhaps. It means identity access management, perhaps, privilege access management, that sort of thing. But knowing when you have an insider threat. So what people spend has to be directly explainable to a CEO in English or French, but it has to be explainable in a way that they'll understand. And CISOs, most of CISOs did not go to Harvard Business School, or Stanford Business School. They went to Carnegie Mellon and got a great degree there or something in computer science. And there really is sometimes a breakdown in how they communicate and how they're heard. There seems to be a different language sometimes between what the CISO is saying and what the CEO and the board are hearing. You have to talk in their language, and that means talking risk management. They get risk management. They've been doing risk management for a while. So if you say, hey, guys, this is not spooky IT stuff. This is not spooky AI stuff that you won't understand. This is just an aspect of risk management. And so let's talk about how much we're willing to spend to avoid these risks versus how much it would cost if it happened.
Right. Great. Speaking about communication, Dick, let's talk about something you and I have talked about in the past, which is the reporting structure of CISOs, who they should report into, and as a follow-on to that, how should boards be made aware of breaches, and what is the sort of the best practices protocol for such a thing?
Well, again, every company is different. There's no one model that works. But I will say the model that doesn't work is having a CISO report directly to the CIO, full stop. That doesn't work because they have two very similar and overlapping sort of Venn diagram, but different jobs. The CIO's job is keeping overall IT costs down and keeping overall runtime up, and ease of use for the people in the company. CISO's job, you have to take those things into account, obviously, ease of use. You don't want to have ridiculous burdensome security where you have to change your password every month to something that you can't remember, and so you write it down under your mousepad. But the CISO's job is really to make sure that we understand in everything we do what is the risk, the security risk, and to take that into account well in advance of the product going live. And that frequently doesn't happen. They don't have that insight. They want to slow things down sometimes. They're perceived, CISOs is perceived as Mr. No, the guy that wants to slow things down and wants to make things more burdensome. All too often when we see a hack that has occurred, and we're doing an after action on the hack that has occurred, the CISO will say to the room, well, gee, if only my request for an endpoint security product had been approved, this wouldn't have happened. Whatever the product is that she mentions. And the CEO will look across the table and say, I didn't know you asked for that. I didn't know you asked for that. I would have approved that if you could have made a case. I didn't even know you asked for that.
Right.
So here's what I say. The CISO can report in a dotted line to the CIO, but also has to have a second path. And that second path could be to the in-house general counsel, could be to a chief risk officer if the company has one, could be to the COO, but ultimately that line gets to the CEO. And if the CISO has been denied the budget she thinks she needs and wants, she needs to be able to appeal that decision and not have that be a big deal. Not have that be a job ender. It should be routine that they're able to make their case for either money or headcount or policies and procedures. Make their case to the CEO. And ultimately, the CEO needs to report to the board. So boards are increasingly creating cybersecurity committees, or they're designating a lead board member. I get stuck usually being the lead board member on boards for cybersecurity. That's fine. But you need to have a structure that reports to the board. In the Equifax case, I don't want to beat Equifax when they're down, but I beat them before they were down. So they don't exactly have the greatest reputation in cybersecurity. But in that case, the board didn't know. The board wasn't informed. No one, no lead board member, no, not the chairman of the board. No one was informed that there was a breach for a very long time. You need to be informing the CEO right away, and the CEO needs to inform someone on the board right away. And there needs to be a group of 2 or 3 board members who, if they're not smart about cybersecurity to begin with, and they probably won't be, you need to educate. Because those board members can be your advocates when you're looking for budget. And they can be your advocates and assist you when there is a breach. The worst thing you can have is that a board that has never talked about cybersecurity or has talked about it only where the CISO comes, once or twice a year and is given half an hour and throws some slides up, and the board members all nod like they understand what you're saying, even though they don't. And they check the box for the minutes that we had a meeting on cybersecurity. That's the worst thing. You need to get to the board members way in advance of a problem and begin to educate them about cybersecurity. So CISO should ultimately have a reporting path to the CEO. The CEO needs to be able to talk to a designated board member and perhaps a board committee. It should not be the audit committee of the board, which frequently people think that's the easy fit. No, it's not the easy fit. That committee is already busy, and it's usually filled with the kinds of people who don't know anything about cybersecurity. They're audit people. So there is going to be a tension between the CIO and the CISO, and that's fine. We should not discourage that in a company. We should encourage that in a company. And the other members of the C-suite need to know that. It's okay for that tension to be there.
So basically, explain the risk, quantify the value, and speak in English terms about what the solution is. So,
yeah, and also, if you can, compare your company to other companies. There are lots of apps now that you can get. Security Scorecard, BitSight, there are others that give you a score, like a FICO score, and compare you to other companies without ever getting inside your network. That's of limited value, but it's of some value. I've been able to drive security spending a lot in one particular company that I'm a board member of by showing them they had a really bad score, and now they have a really good score. So that the money that they spent actually delivered something. Board members like to see metrics, and there are also applications that you can get that will give you an internal score. Now it's hard to compare that to other companies, but having a score of some kind, or take the NIST framework, the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, which is easy to understand. It's very high level. And what it calls for is a self-assessment to show where you are now and where you want to go. So you can establish that and get the board to approve it, get the CEO to approve it and the board to approve it. This is where I am now on the NIST framework. This is where I want to go. And then you can take that and say, we're going to do that over 3 years. Here's how we're going to do it. Here are the things we're going to add. Here's how much money that costs, and therefore here are the increases in budget I need in year 1, 2, and 3. And then at every quarterly board meeting, you can show a red, yellow, green kind of simple progress chart that shows the progress that you're making to get to the thing that the board approved in the NIST framework.
Great. Excellent. Okay, so with all of these changes going on and everything that you just explained about what the CISO's role is in the reporting structure, can you talk a little bit about the background or skills or traits of what today's and tomorrow's senior security executives should be and how they've changed?
Well, most CISOs come out of a computer science background, and that's appropriate. But they need also to have an understanding, an increasing understanding now, of enterprise management. So to the extent that they can get some familiarity with a business background, an MBA kind of background, doesn't mean they need an MBA, but to learn the lingo of the company and try to relate the computer science background to the background that the people you're dealing with have. Now, depending on what vertical you're in, you may be a heavily regulated company. If you're in finance and banking, for example, or if you're a medical company now. So then you need to understand the legal implications You need to understand shareholder suits. You need to understand torts. You need to understand regulatory functions. And to do that, you need to be able to have a dialogue with your in-house general counsel and the out-house general counsel as well that the company has, to get the board to understand, get the CEO to understand, and you too, the CISO, to really understand what the legal and regulatory framework is that you're working in. Because when you prepare a breach plan, a lot of CISOs think the breach plan is just related to computer forensics and discovering how the breach got in and reestablishing security. That's only one aspect of it. A big aspect of every breach plan is a legal plan that should be drawn up in advance. There's also a PR plan in case of a breach that needs to be drawn up in advance. I'm a big advocate of having a comprehensive breach plan, legal, PR, computer forensic, every tab of this plan, and having it approved. Having it approved at a senior level in the company, having a copy on the CEO's desk, and then if there is a breach, everybody knows what they're supposed to do. The best way, however, is to take that plan and to exercise it, to have a tabletop exercise where the CEO plays himself or herself, and you actually run people through 2 or 3 hours of, okay, this has really happened. What do we all do? Because if you haven't exercised that game plan, well, it's like playing football or hockey. You get a great game plan, but if you never exercised it before the game, you're going to lose. Right. So part of the responsibility, I think, of the CISO is to make sure that breach plan is put together, but the CISO can't put it together by themselves. They need the help of the PR people, investor relations, public relations, and certainly legal. And then they need to get everyone involved to spend the 2 or 3 hours to exercise it. And you need to do that at least once a year.
It all makes total sense. Aaron, do we have any questions coming from the attendees that we want to bring forward to
Yeah, we do. Yes, we do. Thank you so much, Richard. We did have some questions come in for you. I just want to remind everyone, though, that right when we're finished the Q&A, we're going to go into the Backstage Pass demo with Scott Penny, so definitely stick around. So, Richard, the first question for you is, from your experience in the industry, can you think of an example of a company that's approaching their cybersecurity in a way that could actually break this cycle that you're talking about?
Yeah, and I think this is very important. When you see all these companies, Yahoo and Target and Sony and the long list, you can get the impression that it's hopeless, and it's not. What you don't see is the long list of companies that have not been hacked, or when they have been hacked have handled it quickly and well and quietly. And that's because those companies don't want to attract attention to themselves. And I don't want to do that either. I don't want to attract attention to specific companies, but I know them. A lot of them are in banking and finance. A lot of them are in defense and aerospace. Those two sectors have prime examples of companies that know how to do this. What distinguishes them? One, frankly, goes back to resources. They spend a lot of money to never have that public breach or never have the breach at all. And they get a lot of highly talented people. You can outsource a lot, particularly if you're a mid-sized company. But if you're a large company, you really can't outsource a lot of these functions. And good IT security people are really hard to find. We have over 200,000 job vacancies in the United States alone for qualified IT security people. So to get a good IT security person, you have to pay. You have to pay a good salary. And the companies that I'm thinking of are paying salaries that are frankly eye-watering and look like they should be CEO salaries in the mid-sized company. So yeah, there are companies. It is possible. I won't name them because they don't like to be named.
Okay, thank you. I have two questions here that I think are well related, so I'm going to ask it as a two-parter. Where do you see the biggest threats coming in the next 5 years, and what can companies do to mitigate their risk against these threats?
Well, the biggest threats are always in the new IT services that have been rushed to market without security designed into them. No matter how long we go on, no matter how many times we say it, if you're thinking of a new IT service, can you please think about security from the beginning? Because security designed in is always better than security that's glommed on afterward. So what are the new things that are coming along now? By the way, examples of that in the recent past are mobile and cloud. We have mobile security now, we have cloud security now, but we didn't when we first brought them out. Now I look at containers. There's a huge rush to containers, and most people haven't figured out how they're going to secure containers. And I look at the so-called IoT, the Internet of Things, where, if you believe the Gartner report, we're going from about 5 billion connected devices this year to about 30 billion 3 years from now. That's a huge increase. And most of those IoT devices, whether it's your car or an elevator or the Coke machine, all of which are going to be connected or already are connected, most of them have no security designed in part because the chipsets are too small, there's not enough memory, whatever. We need to be very careful about rushing into IoT solutions to problems in enterprises until we've figured out how to do security for IoT devices. And frankly, we're not there yet.
Great, thank you. I have a question here that's definitely going to interest any CISOs on the call. Richard, do you have any advice on how CISOs can better get the leverage they need to ensure their security requests are met within their organization?
Yeah, number one, get a board subcommittee and make them your friends and explain things to that board subcommittee. Number two, bring in an outside consulting firm to do a risk profile, a risk audit. That is not meant to be an advertisement for me, but that's what I do, and there are hundreds of companies that do it. Have them come in. Don't do a penetration test, because everybody knows a penetration test is going to succeed in penetrating, and it doesn't tell you anything. But do a risk audit, which is a bit more sophisticated, and come back to that idea of the breach exercise. I have never been more successful in convincing a CEO to spend money on IT security or to take IT security seriously than when I have given them a 2 or 3 hour drill, putting them through their paces and showing them how horrible a breach can be by making them live through one. Now, they have to suspend disbelief. And sometimes they, complain, hey, I'm an important CEO, I don't have time to play games. Well, let me tell you, I've played games, I've done tabletop exercises with presidents of the United States, with prime ministers, with cabinet secretaries, with CEOs of Fortune 50 companies. They play games. That's how you get ready. If you stress test the company, and stress test a CEO, and they have to actually live in the moment. And in part of this, we have a reporter talk to them, and part of it we have them go before a congressional committee. They don't want to do that ever. After you stress test them that way, they say, "Oh my God, whatever you want, we'll do it. I don't want that thing that just happened in the exercise to ever happen in real life.
Got it. Thank you. Yes, for sure. We got a great question here. So, Richard, what are your thoughts on the risk of the supply chain being compromised, and should there be regulations to control this risk?
Well, regulations, at least in the U.S., regulations aren't going to happen because currently in this political environment, regulations are spelled with 4 letters. Regulations are a 4-letter word, apparently. So there's not going to be a lot of new regulations coming along. But I think industry by industry, we need to self-regulate for the supply chain. Banking and financial services has done this already a little with something called shared assessments. So that rather than having every bank go to every vendor, they have established a procedure where if one bank goes and checks out a vendor against an agreed series of requirements, criteria, then that's acceptable for others. And I think that's what we have to do. It's particularly true in software. I think we need to establish a standard for vetting software. There are a lot of vendors now, there are probably 5 or 6 big vendors, a few little ones, that will do code analysis and app security. And they vary enormously in how well they do that. We need to establish a standard. And then we need to say that we're not going to buy software unless you've been certified against this standard. And then whenever the code changes, it needs to go through that process again. It's costly, but if we pool together as companies in an industry, and we can do that, that's not against antitrust. If we pool together and do shared assessments and establish our own regulations, then the supply chain problem becomes a little bit more manageable.
Great, thank you. We only have one more question for you, and that is, as the role of the CISO continues to evolve, what can we do to groom our own people so they'll be successful in that role?
Well, I think it has to be a continuing education process. You know, if you're a heart surgeon, you're board certified in cardiology, and you have to do things to maintain that board certification. And that's true if you're a lawyer, it's true if you're an accountant. You have to have certification against criteria, you have to have testing, and you have to have continuing education programs. I think we need to move to that for CISOs. We do have the CISSP, and there are some certifications, but I think we need to have a sort of industry-established certification process. And until we get there, we at least need to have a continuing education process because the threats change all the time, and the defenses, the tools available change all the time. And you know, you can't really learn what new tools are available by going to the RSA show and walking around the convention floor where there are 2,000 vendors, all of which are saying the same thing. So I think trying to work on some sort of continuing education program and working through nonprofits like the SANS, S-A-N-S, SANS Foundation for continuing education is probably the best thing we can do.
Great. Thank you so much, Richard, and thank you, Michael, as well. That's it for the Q&A, so I guess I'm going to pass it over now to Scott Penny, our Director of Cybersecurity Solutions, and he's going to take us through a quick demo of BlueCat DNS Edge. Scott, you should have control now, if you want to kick it off.
All right, excellent. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Backstage Pass portion of our webinar, which is where we'll be digging into the technology aspect of this discussion. So I think it's safe to say that our jobs as security professionals typically require us to make these technology decisions to support the larger governance, risk, policy issues that Richard and Michael were just talking about. And actually, as Richard mentioned, security organizations today, we tend to spend a lot of time and money throwing new widgets into the environment to try to keep pace with the new threats. And in doing so, we often overlook some of the foundational technologies that are already in place that can be leveraged in a more substantial way. So one of these technologies that gets overlooked is the domain name system, or DNS. So I'm not going to shift our focus to that technology specifically and show you how DNS can be a very effective way to address some of the major risks that exist in the cyber world today. And hopefully I can advance slides. There we go. All right, so we don't have to go very far to find scary headlines that relate to breaches and hacks and things like that. And it's easy for us, I think, to look at these and just sort of throw up our hands and say, okay, it's hopeless. I'm never going to be able to keep up with these sorts of things. And I think that sense of despair maybe, forces us to sort of, just stop digging, right? We're going to do what we can to put the layers in place that we can to try to thwart these things. And we sort of lose the insight into what's common between all of these different attacks. And unsurprisingly, DNS is one of those things that's actually very consistent across all these attacks and how it's leveraged. In fact, research says that about 91% of malware uses DNS in attacks in a number of different ways that we'll get into here in another slide. But the scary thing that we found also in some research of our own is that even though we sort of know that this is true, 68% of organizations don't even bother to monitor DNS. They don't see any value in it, so they don't do anything to leverage that data or leverage the position that DNS occupies within the infrastructure to do some good, and that's obviously a shame. Now, I said that 91% of cyber attacks use DNS in some way, shape, or form. How specifically does that happen? Well, there are a number of ways. We can kind of grossly, collect them into three big buckets. Denial of service attacks, data exfiltration, and command and control. The first one, denial of service, is one of these things that we see in the news, and it's big and it's scary, and they happen with alarming frequency. And this is really where compromised devices are used to overwhelm your defenses and sort of knock you off the internet, regardless of how much protection you try to put in place. And in fact, just a couple of days ago, I think, was the one-year anniversary of a pretty massive denial of service attack against a DNS service provider named Dyn. Dyn was flooded by this Internet of Things botnet known as Mirai, or Mirai-based botnet, and it basically took down their ability to resolve or serve DNS queries, which took some very large organizations offline. They essentially disappeared from the internet because their DNS provider was down. And of course, roughly 1 year after we heard about this one, there's a new one on the horizon. So I don't know if anybody's seen this, but just a few days ago, we started to hear about this IO-Troop botnet, which is sort of the next generation of what Mirai did. And the scary thing about this is it's actually exploiting more vulnerabilities in these IoT devices. And sure enough, if you examine IO-Troop, you'll see that it comes preloaded with a bunch of DNS attack instructions and DNS resolvers that can be used to take down other organizations. So DOS attacks are not going away. And DNS is certainly a key way to carry out these attacks because of its open and trusted nature. So the next one, data exfiltration attacks, this can be as simple as embedding a little bit of data into a DNS query and using that to send a signal to somebody outside the organization, or it could be as sophisticated as establishing a DNS tunnel between a compromised endpoint and some internet-based server that basically allows for full bidirectional communication, copying files, doing remote scanning of networks. Anything that you could do via a VPN connection, you can do via a DNS tunnel connection. So these things are becoming more and more prevalent because, again, DNS is sort of an open and trusting kind of solution that people don't really monitor. So it's really easy to take advantage of some of the weaknesses and exploit those. And the final one, command and control. This one comes into play all throughout the attack lifecycle. So the initial attack is probably being directed by DNS. Somebody has to go to some site to get infected by whatever piece of malware is out there. But then once that system is infected, it's going to use DNS to check in with that command and control system so that they can receive new instructions or updates, be instructed to launch an attack, whatever it may be. And these command and control centers rely on DNS because they're constantly having to move around the internet to stay ahead of content filters and other kinds of block lists that we have in place. So this is just really three examples of how DNS gets used. Let me maybe bring this all into the real world by walking through an example of an organization that is actually paying attention to DNS and using it to enforce appropriate policies across an enterprise. So I'll do this by showing you an example from our largest fictitious customer, Acme Corporation, and how they leveraged our security solution, which is DNS Edge, to augment their existing security posture. So as it turns out, Acme has some very specific concerns that they wanted to address with the DNS security solution. So first and foremost, they wanted to get visibility into what was accessing critical assets on their network. Second, they wanted to lock down those pesky IoT devices that keep getting compromised by malware like Mirai or IoTrue. And finally, they wanted to be sure that data exfiltration activity via DNS and other behaviors were identified and then stopped. So the first thing they did to get their hands around these issues was to create a site and edge for the corporate headquarters here in Grand Rapids, Michigan. So this is the location that they wanted to deploy these specific controls to. Next, they created some lists of domains that they wanted to use to enforce policies against. So the first one they created was a list of sensitive assets that they wanted to monitor people's access to. So I don't know if you guys can see my pointer or not, but in this list they put in their finance server and one of their HR servers. Next, they created a domain list to whitelist the activity of their IoT devices. So in this case, they were concerned about these security cameras that keep getting used in these botnet attacks. Excuse me. So their security team identified the fact that these security cameras, they really only need to talk to one internal server, this recording server, recording.acme.com, in order to do their job. They shouldn't be connecting to things out on the internet to update friend status on Facebook and things like that. So they created that list. And then finally, they wanted to see if anybody within the organization was poking around those IoT devices themselves. So they created a domain list here that has security cameras and some environmental sensors that they were concerned that might be compromised by somebody, using one of these Mirai or IoTools botnet malware variants. So once they had the list of things that they wanted to enforce against, they needed to create some policies to actually do that. So they created 3 policies to enforce these controls. The first was a monitoring policy. So the purpose of this monitoring policy was to watch for clients that were accessing either those IoT devices that we talked about or the other critical assets that they had identified, the finance server and the HR server. So they applied this to the whole site so they can see any activity to those destinations being logged for further analysis. Second, they created a whitelist policy for those IoT devices. So they simply denied all traffic. These things can't go anywhere, except if you're on one of these domains that we put in the exception list, in other words, that recording server. And the final policy was one that was really focused on detecting DNS tunnels and abuse of things we call domain generation algorithms, which are domains that get created in an automated fashion so that you can sort of randomly hide your command and control. So to do this, they simply said, I want to detect and I want to stop tunneling and DGA threat types, and applied that to the whole organization. So once the initial setup was complete, the Acme team was able to just step back and watch for new alerts from Edge in their SIM, just like they do every other security solution that they own. So yesterday, they noticed a spike in alerts from Edge that caused them some concern. So they jumped into the Edge console, and sure enough, there was this noticeable spike here in activity that had been blocked and also activity that had triggered those monitor events. So the first thing they did was they jumped into the Edge console and went to the threat activity feed, where it became pretty obvious that there was something amiss. In this case, they found a lot of evidence of a client that was involved in DNS tunneling and visiting sites that were created using those domain generation algorithms. So they quickly pivoted over to the raw DNS activity for that client, and they found that, like most clients that we have in our networks, this thing is pretty active. It's looking at things outside the organization like Google and Tesla and CNN, but it's also doing a lot of internal things, such as looking at finance servers and external things like going to Amazon. So because this is so overwhelming, they decided to put a filter in place that said, okay, well, I'm really concerned about this infected device doing something nasty internally, right? This lateral movement idea. So they quickly put the filter in place to only look for things that are accessing acme.com resources, and they immediately got a much more manageable list. And as we can see very quickly, they started to find some potential risk. So the first thing they saw was this client, for no apparent reason, started to try to access those security cameras. So perhaps this thing was trying to infect those with some sort of malware, something to note. The other thing they started to see was this client was going to a finance server, trying to access finance.acme.com. This client really has no reason to do that. It was also trying to find some other random information, such as the Security Operations Center, Exchange server, a lab. So this thing was clearly doing some surveillance within the network that was then logged by Edge. Now, because that potentially infected client was accessing one of these IoT devices, the security team decided to now refocus on that IoT device, that webcam, to see what it's up to. And sure enough, now we see that we have this webcam not only going to the recording site like it's supposed to, but also trying to get to those same internally sensitive systems. So perhaps to try to find ways to access, scan for vulnerabilities. Who knows why, but they're showing an interest here that's pretty concerning. They also saw that this IoT device was trying to access external domains that seemed to be created using a domain generation algorithm. This is usually a pretty good indicator it's trying to contact some sort of command and control system. So taken together, the fact that this camera is trying to do internal scans as well as external communication that it shouldn't be doing gives us a pretty solid case that it's been compromised and needs to be quickly remediated. So what does all this really mean, right? We walk through this, we see the use cases, but why do we really care? Well, we think that it is about time to put DNS and the DNS data that it generates to work. So by getting visibility into this data, you gain the ability to detect malicious activity and stop it before it becomes an issue. You can proactively lock down things like Internet of Things devices. You can monitor attempts to access sensitive systems. You can spot and shut down tunneling activity. You can block known bad domains via ingestion of threat feeds and things of that nature. And you can take other proactive actions to protect yourself from these threats. But if you do have an incident, you can also leverage DNS to quickly identify the source of the threat. And then you can use this historical data, right, this recording of what happened on your network to quickly investigate what was going on at the time of that attack and where that attack may have spread from the initial starting point. So this could greatly simplify and speed up the investigation response process that your security teams are executing today. So the example that I just walked through is the kind of thing that we hear from customers all the time. These are the sorts of issues they're trying to tackle. They don't really know how to get started. So the use cases are really very real and present and present significant challenges to a lot of organizations. So if any of this, what we've gone through today, resonates with you, there's a quick and simple way to see what Edge could potentially do for you. We call it a test drive. It's a very easy way to see in the real world what kinds of information, what kinds of threats you can uncover via Edge. If you're interested, just drop us a note at testdrive@bluecatnetworks.com, and we'll talk more about it and see what it could potentially do for you. Well, thanks very much for hanging around for the Backstage Pass. I hope you found it to be informative or at least a little bit thought-provoking. So with that said, Erin, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great, thanks, Scott. All right, so everyone, that's all we have today. I just want to say a big thank you to Richard and for Michael for joining us from around the world today. And as I promised, we will be sharing out a recording of this if you had to step away at any time. Don't worry, you'll get the full recap in your email in the next day or two. So thank you to all of you for joining us this afternoon and for contributing all your questions, and enjoy the rest of your week, everyone. Thank you.
Bye. Thanks, Richard.
Bye-bye.